Hey guys, Mr. Summers here for American Government. Today we're going to be talking Chapter 1, Lesson 3, the role of government in economic systems. Okay, we're going to start right off with some basics of economics. This is going to be a lot of what you're going to hear also in the beginning of your economics class next semester. So in January, some of these things are going to sound very familiar. We're going to be talking about them again. So starting off with definition of two terms, just to get us started. Economics. Economics means the study of how people and nations use their resources to attempt to satisfy the wants and needs of their society. And a lot of times those wants and needs are sometimes limitless or seemingly limitless. Okay. Regulation means control to allocate or distribute or hand out resources. Okay. The key function of government in an economy is to make essential decisions about that economy. And governments take that control in a lot of different ways. They can either take total control of the economy, or they can take very little control of the economy, or it can also be somewhere in between there as well. And we're going to see some examples of each of those. So we start off with talking also about factors of production, something that every economy, regardless of the type it is, has. The factors of production are the things that are needed to create goods and services, okay? So we have producers, the ones who make the goods and services to sell. The distributors, the transportation basically, that transport goods and services to buyers. We have the consumers, those are the people who buy the goods and services and use them. We have labor. Labor is the work that people do. It's also the workers themselves, their skills, their talents, their abilities. Resources. Resources talks about natural resources, okay? Natural goods, materials that are used to make goods and services. So we're talking about, land, lumber, water, metal ores, knowledge, labor. Those kinds of things are natural resources or resources. Now, capital is when you take resources and you create it into a tool that you need for production. So capital is money. It's manufactured resources, so any kind of tool or machinery that is used in order to help you to produce. And entrepreneurs are the ones who are the risk takers. They're the individuals who are taking the risks with the ideas. They use or combine those factors of production together in order to produce the goods and services for the purpose of making profit. Now, all economic systems have to answer three basic economic questions. One, what and how much should be produced? So what should be produced and how much of it should we produce? Two, how should the goods and services be produced? Do we do it by hand, putting things together, or do we do it with machinery? And third, who? Who gets the goods and services that are produced? So basically, who's our market? Who are we producing these things for? Who's going to buy them? Now, economies can be classified in different ways. We can look at it as how they do work, or we can look at it as what political ideology is connected with the economy. Okay, so if we take a look at how they work, there's three different types. There's traditional, market, and command. Okay, but those can kind of also be broken down into the political ideology, and we'll see how that works in just a little bit. So a traditional economy is an economy where the decisions made about those economic choices are based on traditions, customs, religions, okay, old, ancient ways that things have always been done, and that's the way they're still done, okay? They're usually based in agriculture, hunting and gathering, fishing. They usually don't use money. Instead, they use a system of exchange called barter. It's where you exchange one good for another. And we usually find traditional economies in native or aboriginal societies. That's why there's the picture. It's down over there of the Inuit family. Okay, Inuits still use a traditional economy. They also have some elements of capitalism, but they're mostly traditional. Okay, capitalism. Okay, capitalism is an economic system that emphasizes private ownership of the markets and factors of production. Okay, there's freedom of choice. There's individual incentives. Those freedoms and incentives are applied to the workers as well as to the consumers, investors, and business owners. Um, Now, in pure capitalism, the government does not interfere with the economy at all in any way, shape, or form. That means there's no regulation of workers' wages, their hours, their working conditions. There's no regulations on what can be produced or how it can be produced. There's just no rules, no laws, anything. Capitalism is almost like anarchy in economy. There's no government control. Okay? The goal of capitalism is to create what we call a free market. A market can be physical or it can be virtual, but it's basically a place wherever goods and services of all types are sold and bought. The free market or free enterprise refers to that economic system where government has no limits on freedoms. There's no government regulation. Consumers and sellers make their economic decisions all on their own. Now, where do we get the idea of capitalism from? Well, in the 1700s, a guy by the name of Adam Smith, an Enlightenment philosopher, Scotsman, actually, he's from Scotland, wrote a book in 1776, to be exact, called The Wealth of Nations. It actually was published right after the Declaration of Independence came out. Not that it had any bearing on what he wrote. But anyway, Adam Smith suggested that government should take what he called a laissez-faire approach to the economy, which basically means that the government should leave the economy alone, not bother with it, not touch it, just stay out of it altogether. He kind of made this hint of this thing that he referred to as an invisible hand, the natural forces of the market being the controlling factor of the economy instead of the government. And we'll talk more about the invisible hand and laissez-faire later. But at the time when Smith was writing this, the most common form of economy was known as mercantilism. And mercantilism was a lot like capitalism. It was an economy that depended on really large supplies of gold and silver. How did countries get this gold and silver? Well, they'd go out and they'd take over lands, dig that gold and silver up, take it back home and use it as money. Or they would take natural resources from other lands, colonies, take those natural resources back home, turn them into manufactured goods, and then sell those manufactured goods all over the world. Okay? It's basically what England did with the American colonies. England took the tobacco, the cotton, the indigo, the rice, the hemp from the American colonies, took it back to England, and turned it into things that they could sell all over the world and got their gold and silver that way. Okay. Now, in capitalism, competition is key. You cannot have capitalism without competition. Competition means that you have buyers and sellers competing with each other for prices, for resources to produce the goods and services, for products themselves. Okay, so sellers compete for those resources to produce the goods and services. They also compete for consumers. They compete to see who can, make the most money by selling the most goods to the most people. How many more people can they get on their side? Consumers compete over limited products to buy. So when you go to the store, it's kind of first come, first serve as to who gets the products that are at the store, right? Eventually they run out and then you don't get any. And we've experienced that a lot this year in 2020, right? Go to the store to get toilet paper and somebody beat you. They bought all the toilet paper. Now you don't have toilet paper. And what are you going to do? We've seen a lot of that this year. Consumers competing, starting fights over toilet paper, which, if you had told somebody a year ago that people would be fighting in Walmart over toilet paper, they would have thought you were just flat out crazy. And here we are. Okay, now workers also have competition. Workers compete with each other to sell their skills and labor for the best wages and salaries they can get to producers. Okay, so when you go looking for a job, you go hunting for a job, you are selling your skills, your knowledge, you're selling basically yourself and the things that you can do to an employer to get a wage that they're offering you. Okay, so think about that the next time you go out looking for a job. You're basically a salesperson. You're selling yourself. Now, pure capitalism kind of doesn't really exist anymore. It did for a while, but there's five basic characteristics of pure capitalism. And these basic characteristics do influence capitalism still today. And first of all is private ownership and control of property and economic resources. Second, that free enterprise or free market. Competition, okay, freedom of choice, and then lastly, and some would argue most importantly, the possibility of profits. Nobody gets into the business of capitalism unless they desire to make profits. Nobody opens a business unless they're hoping to make profits. Well, almost nobody. So here in the US, we are the leading example of free enterprise or free market system of capitalism. Our society is so deeply rooted in individual freedom and individual choice, the value of that individual initiative. These ideals make us the number one, the best spot for free market and capitalism to survive, because it's all about that freedom of choice. Okay. However, over the years, our government has evolved to become a little bit more and more involved in the economy. So we actually have what we call a mixed economy, a blending of capitalism and socialism. Okay, so we're actually not completely capitalistic. We are actually a mixed economy. The government has a lot of control over many aspects of the economy and regulates businesses. Okay, we have all kinds of regulations on how many hours a week people can work, how much money they can make, how many taxes they have to pay. We have regulations on safety protocols. I mean, licenses for businesses. There's a lot of regulation that happens. Some businesses, they're told exactly how they can run and can't run. Okay? Government has also become the single largest consumer of goods and services in the US and worldwide. The federal government kind of began regulating businesses mostly to protect consumer health and product safety. So, as people were starting to consume things and get sick, children were dying while taking medications and things like that. People started to speak up and say, hey, we need the government to step in and do some sort of regulation. Government needs to protect us. They need to provide for our welfare and safety. And so they started to demand that government make laws regarding these things. Then the 1930s come along, the Great Depression, and people start asking the government to make regulations even more on economics, on the banking industry and the markets. Okay? And so the government took on the role of being a provider of economic safety, a regulator, and a provider of services, all because the people asked for it. So government has become more and more involved because people ask for it. Okay? So that brings us to what is socialism. So we said that the US is a mixed economy of capitalism and socialism. Well, socialism is an economic system in which government plays a significant role in the economy, but it doesn't control it completely. It may control parts of the economy, but not the entire economy. Okay? In some socialist economies, the government owns most of the land, the basic industries, and some other means of production. It's actually government planners who determine the best use of resources and then distribute those resources, the products, and the wages out to the society. Okay. Government also in socialism provides extensive social services such as free education, free transportation, free health care, and welfare services for its citizens. So you can see where we are, you know, ever more evolving into a bit more socialist. Okay. Now, socialism evolved because of what people saw happening in the Industrial Revolution. Um, People observed that capitalism was great for very few. It made some people extremely wealthy, almost godlike in wealth, but others were suffering greatly. And so reformers began calling for government involvement to protect workers, others living in extreme poverty due to a lack of regulation. People were working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. You might remember this from your US history classes. And they couldn't bargain for any better conditions or better pay. So, what could they do? Well, they began kind of getting together. They started demanding that the government step in and make regulations. So in the late 1880s to the early 1900s, reformers really pushed. They felt that capitalism was causing people to suffer, and that wasn't right, that no one should suffer or starve, especially when there were so few people making so much profit. They believed that under a pure capitalist system, there was just no way for any kind of economic fairness. So they asked the government to take more control over the economy in order to more equally distribute the goods, services, and wealth. Now, people who oppose socialism say that it's bad because it stifles individual initiative. They say that government would require high taxes to pay for social services, and the high taxes would stifle economic growth. They say that socialism requires such an increase in government regulation of industry, making the government grow bigger and bigger, and eventually leading towards authoritarianism or dictatorship. Okay? So, you have to have your give and take, right? Not saying that all these things are true. They're not all false either, though. Now, there are different forms of socialism. Uh, there is what is known as democratic socialism. Okay, so democratic socialism is kind of what it sounds like. If you're a socialist who is committed to democracy, you're a democratic socialist. So that means that you want democracy. You want people to be able to vote and choose and have those freedoms of choice, but you want government involvement in the distribution of wealth and the control of industry. Okay, Bernie Sanders is an example of a democratic socialist. Okay, he's all for voting and choosing your leaders and democracy and a lot of individual freedoms, but he also wants more government control. He'd like the government to help with the distribution of wealth by increasing taxes on the ultra wealthy. Okay, so under democratic socialism, citizens still have all the basic protected individual rights, freedom of speech, press, all that kind of stuff. The change is in the economic sphere, though. Okay, government will have more regulatory responsibility and control over industries like transportation, healthcare, energy, water, defense, telecommunications, education, those areas. Democratic socialism will also usually tax like I said, the ultra rich at a much higher rate to try to close tax loopholes, making sure that large companies and the super wealthy pay their share of taxes, relieving that burden from the middle class and the poor. So last, communism and command economy. So command economy is kind of also the way it sounds. It's an economic system in which the economic decisions are made or commanded by a central government and then handed down to the rest of the country. in in pure communist countries, the state owns all the land, all the natural resources. They own all the industries. They own the banks, transportation, communications. They own it all. There is no private property ownership. No individuals own anything. All mass communications, newspapers, television, magazines, radio, internet is all controlled by the government. Okay? So it's a very authoritarian system for economics as well as in their government. Okay? Now, where do we get these ideas of socialism and communism from? Back in the 1800s, there was this German philosopher by the name of Karl Marx. Now, Marx wrote during the height of the Industrial Revolution, like I said, about the mid 1800s. And he was really concerned about the suffering that he saw that was created by industrialization. So in his idea, he said that industrialization created really deep divides between who he called the bourgeoisie, which is a French term that refers to capitalists who own the means of production, and the proletariat. Those are the workers who produce the goods, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Okay, bourgeoisie are the wealthy, the owners of goods and property. The proletariat are the workers. Okay, so yes, he and a guy by the name of Friedrich Engels wrote what was called the Communist Manifesto, where they basically put out these ideas. Now, they're only philosophers. It's only theory, right? Okay. Now, Marx predicted that the proletariat would eventually revolt against the bourgeoisie and collapse capitalism worldwide. And at first, the workers would create a socialist government. But ultimately, over time, the goal would be to become communist, where there's no government at all. The people collectively own all the means of production. Okay, there'd only be one class, be the working class, and all property would be owned collectively. So there'd be no need for government. However, Karl Marx's visions of communism never ever came to actual fruition, so they never actually happened. His ideas of communism were taken, they were involved into an economic system under authoritarian governments, dictatorships, and oligarchies. So, communism today. There are really only a few countries today that are communist. You have North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, and China. Okay, so with the flags there, you've got North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, and China. There they are, okay? Cuba and China, though, have added elements of capitalism into their economies, so they're like a mixed economy with capitalism and communism, okay? Still authoritarian governments, but they've added a little bit of freedom and property ownership into their economies. Government, though, still maintains control over major parts of the economy, and that's how they are today. Okay, so here's where we have the economic systems and how they're involved in government, or how government is involved in economic systems. Okay, going from free market to communism, increasing with government involvement more and more as we go. Make sure you've taken good notes. Rewind if you need to. Slow it down if I'm talking too fast. And make sure, hit that subscribe button, hit that thumbs up, and we'll see you next time.